I think we are live, friends, and I will say hello to the people out there. Hello, folks out there. You are witnessing a wonderful invention. It's called live streaming. My name is Metta Spencer, and I'm here in Toronto with some friends of mine who are not here in Toronto. Gemmell is in Mississauga, and Allison Pytlak is in Manhattan. And we're going to be joined, I think, shortly by Paul Meyer, who's still getting some help trying to get his thing going. And but we're going to have a good conversation. I must say that the reason for doing this is that I'm organizing a big forum here in Toronto. It's called How to Save the World in a Hurry. And it addresses 6 different global issues. And they're interrelated. And so I think it makes sense to address them as a package. But they require a certain amount of background for people who are, if you're conversant with one issue, may not be with the others. So what we've been doing is holding conversations with people who do know about particular aspects of other issues. And we put them on our website, and we put them on other places where you can access them. And that way you can have a look at them and get smart before you come to the forum, which will take place on the 30th and 31st of this month. It's just a couple of weeks away at University College. And if you need to know more about that, and I sure hope you do, go to the website called tosavetheworld.ca. And you can find out about the program and the wonderful speakers that we're going to have and so on. But the main point is I want you to know that we're doing this for you so that you will be really well informed about a bunch of different issues that will come up at the forum. It's a 2-day forum, and you want to study up a bit. So our conversation tonight will mainly be about cyber attacks. But I want to introduce the 2 speakers who are our panelists at the moment, ready to roll. First one is Allison Pytlak, who is with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in New York, right across the street, I think it is, from the UN. And she does research, and she follows disarmament issues, and just got back 2 or 3 days ago from a long period in Geneva where they were having the preparatory committee meetings for the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. And so she can bring us up to date on the things that she saw there. Same with Paul Meyer, ambassador retired. Paul Meyer in Vancouver is going to join us when all the equipment gets put together. And he also was in Geneva for this meeting, and therefore they can tell us what went on there, and especially how it relates to the concerns that we are mainly focusing on today, which is cybersecurity. And Jack Gemmell is with us. Jack Gemmell is a lawyer here in Toronto. Am I allowed to say that you're now busy with a murder trial?
Sure.
I can say that. That's interesting, because I don't know whether that, things like that can be confidential. I don't know. I hope not. Anyway, it sounds like a very interesting thing that someday I want to have coffee with you and find out about that. Anyway, let me start off by having say hello to Allison. And Allison, can you tell us a bit about this conference that you went to in Geneva? And the part that, I think you and Paul went to different sessions or different breakout groups. I guess they called them, but something else. I don't know. Anyway, can you tell us where you went and what you learned in Geneva?
Yeah, definitely. Happy to. And hello to everybody out there.
Part of what the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom does is we provide monitoring and analysis of a lot of different UN disarmament and arms control conferences. So conferences relating to the Nuclear Nonproliferation or NPT Treaty are among those that we monitor and provide analysis on. For those of you who are maybe less familiar with how the NPT works, it works sort of in 5-year increments. And so every 5 years, there's a review conference, which is meant to be an opportunity to take stock of how states parties are doing with their treaty obligations and commitments. And then in the run up to that review conference, there are these preparatory committees, one per year. Short form for that is PrepComs. And that's what this meeting was that began in late April and ended on May 4th that Paul and I were at. I think it was sort of an interesting meeting in that I think we really saw a lot of the real life tensions kind of creeping into the conference room. A lot of these conferences tend to be very set piece. There's a lot of prepared statements being read by governments across a very wide range of issues that the NPT covers. And usually, and in a lot of cases, they can be quite predictable. You almost know what states are going to say. That was, again, the case in this meeting. But where things sort of got interesting is that there were a lot of rights of reply happening toward the end of each session every day. And I think that you can kind of tell in the tone of the rights of reply between the US and Russia, between the US and Iran, and others, sort of all these real life tensions that were creeping into the NPT context. And by that, I mean things around the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal, which was in the news a lot over this past weekend, what's been happening with North Korea and with South Korea. And so it created sort of a very tense atmosphere in the conference room. But at the same time, I think a lot of us, Paul and I, were definitely talking about this quite a lot. There doesn't seem to be yet any sense of urgency among the states parties to really, take on these problems. And they're very much on the defensive, saying, the NPT is still the cornerstone of the non-proliferation regime. A lot of them, well, not a lot of them, but some of them were bashing the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. But I think what the takeaway is that if you really want to maintain that there is credibility and value in the NPT, then states parties need to start to sort of wake up and do more to make progress on the commitments that they've agreed in the past. Because at the moment, it's not looking that way at all, and it's really undermining its credibility overall.
Thank you. Okay, it's a bit gloomy, but I don't know whether Paul has anything to cheer us up about. Now we are joined by Paul Meyer. I'm glad you got the equipment going. Let's see if your voice actually works, Paul. Speak.
Speak. Okay. Well, hello, Metta and Allison and Jack. Greetings from Vancouver. I can only broadly endorse what Allison just described in terms of the NPT PrepCom. I think there is a gap between the process and inside the Palais des Nations and what is happening in the real world, and that highlights, unfortunately, that developments outside are not being reflected adequately in the positions being taken by the delegations that are present. And I had flagged, I thought, 2 areas where there were ideas in terms of new proposals that have a certain practical appeal, and they were significantly put forward by something called the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative. And that's a grouping of 12 non-nuclear weapon states that have encouraged from the 2010 NPT Review Conference a sort of focus on implementation and transparency regarding that. And this, after all, is something ultimately that is essential
Mm-hmm. You kind of hung up here on mine. I don't know. Okay. I think you're still speaking. Anyway, let me see if we can get Jack on, and at least we'll know that we're moving. Jack, can you speak? And let's see if we can hear you.
Hi, Metta.
Hi. Okay, good. And we'll have to come back to Paul in a minute whenever whatever went wrong it seized up a bit. Yeah, now I think we want, the main purpose of this particular conversation, is that I really would love for us to get smart about what it is we need to do about the growing, I assume, threat of cyber attack. At any rate, it's certainly more and more in the news. And I know that Jack, a couple of years ago, maybe now, you did write a document, which was, I think, a submission to the Canadian government's Defense Policy Review, recommending some changes in the way we approach regulating control over and maybe agreements not to use certain methods of attack against each other. You want to elaborate on what you proposed at that time, and then let's see whether Allison and Paul can comment on whether or not that was is consistent with what they would recommend, and whether it goes far enough.
Hi, Metta. Well, the document I wrote was for Science for Peace, and was with respect to the consultation on cybersecurity that the Canadian federal government was running. And my take on it was a little different. I felt that one of the major problems in this area is essentially the weaponization of the internet by nation states. And we've seen over a number of years the use of very sophisticated cyber attacks by nations to achieve all sorts of various goals, legitimate or not so legitimate. And certainly one of the side effects of the governments being involved in this kind of activity is that, of course, it impacts negatively on cybersecurity generally. The government agencies that are engaging in this kind of conduct, in fact, have a vested interest in maintaining the malware and flaws in the software we all use in order to take advantage of it.
Sorry, maintain what clause?
To maintain the malware and the flaws in the software that we all use in order to take advantage of it for their own purposes. And this is particularly disastrous because it allows nation states to target other nation states with respect to their critical infrastructure. And there's been a number of examples of that. There was a recent example of suspected cyber attacks in the Ukraine, probably originating out of Russia. Mm-hmm. So taking the paradigm of the Arms Control Treaty, I thought what we should do is Canadian government should take a good look at seeing whether or not the equivalent of something like the biological or chemical warfare treaty could be applied in a limited context in this area, so that nation states would at least agree not to employ these tools against the critical infrastructure of their of other nations.
Well, let me ask you, because I'm a little. You say that they want to keep malware in the structure, the software. Are you suggesting that if they just take the malware out, that would be the solution, that you would have a technological solution that would keep people from being able to use bad things and do bad things to each other? That is there really a technological solution, and they're leaving it in because they want it, and that's the only reason that it's continuing? Or
we have the example last year of the WannaCry ransom attack, which spread rapidly through for example, hospitals in Britain. And that was used an exploit that the NSA had used for years called Eternal Blue. And a series of hackers hacked the NSA and released the toolkit of some of their hacking tools, one of which was Eternal Blue, which was used to create the WannaCry ransomware, which then spread rapidly through the infected networks. So that's an example of how the company, knowing that there was a serious flaw, it was in Microsoft Windows networking, nevertheless didn't tell Microsoft, continued to exploit it, and really only told Microsoft at the last moment to no avail.
Would there be countries that want to leave flawed software so they can use it? Or I guess what I want to know is it a problem that we need to pass some laws and just say nobody's allowed to do this? Or is it also a problem that we have to have a procedure for going and finding out the things, the little tools they put in there to make it possible? How much of the solution is a technological one, and how much of it is just like writing a treaty where everybody promises not to do bad things to each other?
Well, the technological problems are very daunting. The internet, when it was designed, was not designed with security in mind. And a lot of the standard protocols, such as emails, are just full of holes. And that's certainly one of the major problems. The advantage of it is it's created a very loose and flexible structure that was able to grow very quickly. The bad news is that it's full of flaws and it's easy to exploit, either in the most primitive ways or the most sophisticated ways. But unfortunately, Metta, what's happening is, in fact, we're going the wrong way. For example, in Canada, we have Bill C-59, which has given powers to the Canadian Communication Security Establishment to in fact engage in cyber attacks for either so-called defensive purposes or for offensive purposes. So, and this is a trend right across the world. And what you're seeing is a rise of a kind of the ethos of tit for tat, which of course just creates more trouble and creates an endless cycle of tits and tats. And I thought, for that reason, that one way to try and at least slow that down a bit is through a treaty process.
Well, actually, that's interesting because there's a guy I know, I like him a whole bunch, but he, when we started talking, his approach is, yeah, we need to get more aggressive. We need to develop all these tools so we can fight real hard if it comes to that. And I was, he's sort of a peacenik, but he wasn't then, in my opinion, because it didn't fit with what I had heard Paul Meyer talking about last year. Paul came and gave the Eric Fawcett Day lecture, which we have every year. And this one, he talked about regulating cyber space and the process that had been taking place at the UN with this GGES, one of the governmental experts or something. Paul, maybe you can explain your own view about this and whether, where your opinion fits in with or contradicts what we've been saying.
Well, I mean, in a nutshell, it's essentially, do we want to preserve this new, unique environment of cyberspace for peaceful purposes, or do we want to accept it as just another domain for cyber warfare and conflict among states? And we're at early days in this. I think it could go either way, but unfortunately, the advocates for cyber peace seem increasingly eclipsed by those that are projecting cyber war as the future. And I think that poses a dire threat to the predominantly civilian nature of the both owners and users of the internet and cyberspace more generally. And
okay,
Canadian government seems to be moving in that what I would suggest a more negative direction, rather than investing in diplomatic initiatives to try to preserve this. And the UN group of governmental experts that we referred to, particularly the 2015 report from that group, was positive in outlining a number of basically confidence building measures or restraint measures that I think at least would have moderated cyber conflict, if not prohibited it.
Okay. Before you came, Allison and I were talking about what went on in Geneva. I think you, Paul, went to a different set of sessions from hers when she attended, so you went to different ones. And she mentioned that there was a session at the NPT thing about outer space. And what's that triggered in my memory is that just yesterday, I had a conversation with a woman who scared the bejabbers out of me. She's a well-informed person. And she says that it doesn't matter what country did it. The main thing is a country was able to shoot down, I believe she said, a plane with lasers. Now, 20 years ago, I remember thinking, these ICBMs are useless. We don't need ICBMs. And pretty soon, they're just going to be able to position things in outer space and send a ray that's going to melt anybody who tries to move a muscle they don't like. And my friends in Pugwash laughed at me because they said, that's too far in the future. Well, sounds like that's what they've got now. Only she says, well, they're not publicizing it exactly. Can either of you tell me whether this is a fantasy? Are they nearly getting there? Because this would be cyber attack plus on steroids if they can just shoot down a plane with a ray, a laser, or anything else. Tell me, am I crazy, or is this woman crazy, or is there something to this?
Well, I think it's an exaggeration. Yes, there's research on lasers, but the physics of it is such that it's, I think, unlikely to be an effective weapon for many decades to come, if ever. So the current use is more that it might temporarily disable the optical sensors, for example, of a satellite. But the power requirements, which diminish by a function of distance, are such that it's just not feasible currently to have a laser that would be an effective weapon against a plane or a satellite or an incoming missile, for example. And that is still sort of in the science fiction realm.
Oh, good. I feel much better. Thank you very much. Because she really had me worried. Allison, you said, I believe you said you went to the outer space section or something. Bring that in, and can you talk, or maybe you didn't, maybe it was Paul, I don't know. But one of you went to the outer space thing, and I want to hear how that connects with our concern about cyber attacks.
Well, maybe I should clarify, because it was, I think, my conference, which is a major effort supported by the Simons Foundation with UNIDIR, the UN Institute for Disarmament Research, and a US NGO called Secure World Foundation. And it just so happened that the Monday and Tuesday after the NPT PrepCon, we had the annual Space Security Conference, which is an excellent vehicle for bringing together a diverse group of stakeholders that have an interest in keeping space for peaceful purposes. And again, there are some interesting parallels, of course, between outer space as an environment and cyberspace as an environment, both of which are increasingly important to society, both of which are vulnerable to attack. But there's a different governance structure in the two realms. But I believe that there is a stakeholder community that needs to get more engaged in trying to ensure that governments do not engage in irresponsible conduct in outer space. And that is the, I guess, overriding objective of that particular conference.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let me ask another wild question. One of the people coming to our forum on the 30th and 31st is a guy named Paul Werbos. And the reason I invited him is that somebody called my attention to a paper that he had produced about the risk of attacking electric grids. And since, you know, there was a book by Ted Koppel 3 or 4 years ago on that subject called Lights Out. And I tried to get Ted Koppel for this forum, but he couldn't or wouldn't or something. Anyway, he didn't. But Paul Werbos will come and talk about that. And I wonder if any of you are familiar with the debate, or maybe there's no debate, maybe there's a complete consensus about what the threat is regarding potential for whole electric grids to be shut down. Anybody want to swing at that?
Well, I think it's a reality. I really think it's a reality. I think there's already been instances where they suspect there's been either attempts or actually successful attacks on electrical grids. Electrical grids are very, very heavily managed. They're extremely complex, and they rely heavily on the ability to shift loads across the network in order to keep it running. And that in itself relies heavily, of course, on computer technology, computer networking. So it's by no means beyond the it's very much possible that someone could be able to do that, and it is, of course, something which is of great concern in really virtually all the countries around the world. And the question is, how do you protect your electrical grid?
Well, what do they do? Is there any real effort to take steps to protect it, or are they just keeping their fingers crossed and praying?
Well, I might point out that a function of the publicity given to certain threats is that the sectors concerned are made aware of the nature of those threats and have the opportunity to take remedial action to either exclude or moderate the possible effects. So I think there's, while you're right, there's a lot of attention being given to the threat of cyber attack against power grids, that at the same time, many of the utilities involved are taking additional steps to protect themselves from just such attacks. And in that degree, maybe it would not be as apocalyptic as sometimes projected. But like anything, there's always, you're only secure as the weakest link in the chain, and there definitely are entities that would be susceptible. And similar to other areas that are critical for the normal functioning of society. And getting back to that reference to the GGE and possible measures, one of the key ones is a commitment not to target critical infrastructure. So in my mind, if you could get leading cyber powers to agree even on that modest restriction on what they might engage in terms of cyber conflict, it would already be a gain, and has some analogy with the protective status accorded under the Geneva Conventions to certain civilian non-combatant and, let's say, health facilities. So I think we need to bring some of that same mentality to bear on arrangements for cyberspace.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. As I understand it, that they did, this GGE panel came up with something, but it's been on the shelf and nobody's done anything about it. Allison, you're based at the UN or on the border of the UN, and you must be following what goes on about cyber issues when people at the UN get together and talk about it. What can you share with us what you think is going on, if anything, at the UN along these lines to help build a structure to protect our infrastructure, or any other rules that would constrain people who want to go doing bad things with cyber weapons?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the GGE process has sort of come to a grinding halt over the last year. These GGEs have been meeting, I think, since 2004. So there's been many rounds of them, and each one has sort of progressed in different ways and on different things, sort of with the objective of establishing norms of behavior for states in cyberspace. The last GGE, which was meeting, I think it met 2 or 3 times. It had meant to agree to a final report by consensus, but it wasn't able to do so. And these GGEs were closed to states that were not chosen to participate in it. They were also closed to civil society. But what we've heard sort of in the aftermath of that group ending is that one of the main sticking points was about the applicability of international humanitarian law. In the course of a cyber attack or a cyber operation, with some states saying that this must absolutely be a criteria and part of the conversation, and then other states saying that no, it has no place there, because then you presuppose, this was their argument, you presuppose then that you are in a state of conflict if IHL is being applied, which was sort of, I think, a clever way of using the arguments that we often use against ourselves a little bit. So because of that, a consensus report wasn't agreed. And now no one really knows what the next steps will be in the UN context in discussing the cyber security issue. I should say, though, that it is being discussed in other ways. The human rights community in the UN is talking about sort of the human rights aspects of the issue. But if you're looking at it from sort of a disarmament, arms control, or security perspective, coming out of the UNGA First Committee, right now things there are very uncertain. When the GA met in the First Committee last October, some states came with ideas of where we could go next. Most really regretted that this was the outcome, and so it's not clear now where things will go. I've definitely seen the cyber issue coming up more and more in other fora. It came up at the NPT meeting with respect to the vulnerability of nuclear weapon systems to cyber attack, which is sort of, there's a really great report put out late last year by Chatham House, which sort of outlines some of these dangers and vulnerabilities in greater detail. It also came up a lot at an earlier meeting I was at in April about autonomous weapon systems, which the hope there is to prevent the development of autonomous weapons. And one of the
robots, I think we call them.
Robots would probably be the the easier way of saying it. But it's also relevant there because, again, you're talking about remote systems which become vulnerable to hacking and to interference. And so all of these things are starting to run together in a lot of ways.
Are the people, I mean, you say there are certain states that, of course, want to keep their weapons, presumably, and are not agreeing to what other people wanted to have happen. Are they the usual suspects? Are they the countries that are also the guys who want to keep their nuclear weapons? Or is there a different crew wanting to have to take advantage of the head start they must have in cyber technology?
It's a lot of the same players. I think that what's different is that you can't hold a cyber weapon in the way you can hold a nuclear weapon. So there's a lot more ambiguity and misinformation or no information rather about having a cyber weapon stockpile. And I think that sort of intangibility of what a cyber weapon is one of the big complicating factors in trying to discuss, how to regulate them, how to work with this in a legal way. And that's also where you sort of see, intention coming into it. If you've got something that's dual use, and we've seen this with other types of dual use items, when does it become problematic? When it becomes problematic when the intended use of that item is malicious or wrong in some way. And I think that these sort of unknowns and intangibilities are making it more difficult to talk about regulation than when you're talking about, small arms and light weapons or something like this.
Yeah, well, okay. Now, it seems to me that there are two different dimensions to this thing. One would be if you're talking about using cyber equipment to launch somebody else's ICBM, or to launch, to start a nuclear war because you can control their physical weapons. That's pretty malicious, all right. That you'd have to call that malicious. But there's a much a more ambiguous question about things like hacking and destroying somebody else's election systems, putting Donald Trump into the White House instead of Hillary Clinton or something. To my mind, that's a very good, interesting question. Is that a cyber attack? Is that something that should be included on if we had a treaty, would you have to include something about thou shalt not disinform people with your cyber equipment? Tell me, I don't know, all of you may have opinions as to where to draw the line about what is conceivably controllable and what should be not covered.
Well, I've always felt that like Paul said, the real way to start at something pretty well everyone can agree on, which is thou shalt not attack thy neighbor's critical infrastructure using cyber weapons. It's relatively easy to define, and it's like biological or chemical warfare. It's just something that shouldn't be done. It's just off limits. One of the problems in this area, though, is when you look at it, is of course, cybersecurity is a little like national security, and it can become a means of justifying restrictions on civil liberties, freedom of expression. And that really, when you start getting into that area, it becomes extremely difficult to get a consensus. I think, if I recall, Russia had at one point proposed a kind of internet cybersecurity treaty, but a lot of it was used to justify repressive internal measures in countries, which of course, that's a real problem in the countries like Canada, which have a belief in freedom of expression.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you guys agree with his cutting point? His cutting point is infrastructure. Is that the main point of the place? Anything that's going to destroy somebody else's infrastructure is verboten.
Well, you have to begin somewhere, and as Jack noted, that's both something that's very important, but also readily delineated and relates to a tradition, if you will, of protective status for non-combatant civilian necessities. It's complex. For instance, you sort of alluded to misinformation campaigns. Well, they've been going on for centuries. It's just that cyber has introduced a new magnitude and capacity there. And espionage per se has always eluded international agreement. So I don't think we're going to be getting much progress on that front anytime soon. It's interesting that in the US list of critical infrastructures, they didn't have their electoral systems initially. And it was only after the Russian interference in the 2016 election that you had a sort of rapid catch-up effort by the executive branch to include electoral systems as part of critical infrastructure. So, I mean, it points, and this is one of the challenges, is countries conceive of critical infrastructure in different ways. Apparently, movie studios had been part of that initial listing, but not the democratic system. And we'll have to, I think, adjust to some of those, realities. We've seen, maybe this is a positive element, that because so much of the internet and cyberspace is in civilian hands, private sector players, they are now getting more engaged. And so you see belatedly the Facebooks and Twitters of the world now acknowledging that they should be more far-reaching in their efforts to identify and exclude bots, non-authentic account holders, clearly politically motivated ad campaigns, etc. So it is useful that there are entities that may themselves also help reduce this. But in the end, it's also on everyone's shoulders, anyone who uses the internet, also to try to reduce their own vulnerability to being manipulated or scammed or otherwise taken advantage of. So that speaks to just better standards of, sometimes referred to as cyber hygiene, is always a good thing too.
Oh yeah, but don't get me started, because on this one I happen to have passionate feelings. I spend 18 hours a day lately trying to organize a forum, and it's an impossible thing now. It's 10 times harder than it used to be because people are practicing cyber hygiene. That is to say, they do not want anybody to know their email address or their phone number. And if you leave an email, if you send an email, they won't answer it. They won't even open it. And they will not answer phone messages. And I would say that this new obsession with privacy and concern that somebody's going to find out something bad about you and be able to use it against you is a more dangerous, this concern is more dangerous than the problems that they're trying to prevent. In other words, if somebody gets my medical records or my bank account information, I don't know what they can do to me. Maybe they harm me a little bit, but I tell you, they are really harming me every day when they keep me from being able to make a phone call to somebody that 2 or 3 years ago I would have been able to reach easily. And I can't contact people. I think that this obsession with privacy and fear of each other, people are now hiding from each other, and they won't make themselves available. It's very troubling to me, but I agree it's not part of your topic for the evening. And
well, it isn't. It is in one sense, because one of the problems with the internet, if you've ever gone on it, is the problem with trolls. And of course, part of the Russian campaign was to organize armies of trolls to suppress things they didn't want to hear and promote things they did want to hear.
Bad things, no doubt about it. But how is that different from advertising? You know, I try to send emails out about my forthcoming forum, and I know that 90% of my emails will never be opened. There are figures showing how many people actually have stopped opening their emails and they use other means of communication. Anyway, I've hijacked this conversation in a direction it should not go. So I'm going to keep quiet, and you guys can tell me what the world needs to know about the cyber threats. Hear me being silent?
I don't know. Well, maybe one sort of further thing to think about, and going back to what we were saying before about critical infrastructure, is that, yeah, I think it's a much easier starting point to think about actions and behavior than it is to try to tackle this problem by looking at the stuff or the things of cyber weapons, cyber war. So that's probably a good approach. I think it's also important to sort of, bear in mind what is the reality of cyber attacks to date. There have been some big and sophisticated operations that we've learned about. but there's also a lot of stuff that happens every day that's maybe more in the area of espionage, as Paul was saying, which sort of falls under this other gray area. So I think that it's good to sort of not put this issue aside. It's very important, but to be realistic and pragmatic in looking at what are the actual patterns of activity and behavior, and not getting caught up in a lot of hype and hyperbole around it.
So it is, you'd say, unless it's really happened to somebody, don't worry about it.
Well, so. No, I don't know if I want to be that cautious either. But I think there was sort of, maybe it's died down a bit now, but I feel like there was a point where there was sort of this general like panic and mania about, you know, cyber wars coming, cyber attacks, especially if you look sort of into the academic literature on it. You really see this sort of like two schools of thought of the pragmatists and the threat inflationists, or however you want to say it. And I think, you know, it's just good to be practical about what is happening in cyberspace and what is the patterns of activity that constitute attacks, and thinking about, are they actually an attack, or is it some other kind of bad action, and sort of think about your responses from that direction.
Oh, come on. Honestly, I think you really are saying, if it hasn't happened, don't worry about it. I'm worried about a lot of things that wouldn't faze you. I'm worried about terrorists learning how to, you know, use hacking to do something like what we mentioned a minute ago, launch somebody else's ICBM. If they can, and I think it's Bruce Blair who said that, yeah, we can't be sure that they can't do that. Maybe it's not Bruce Blair. Somebody said it.
It was Bruce Blair, yes. He wrote a piece for the New York Times pointing out some potential vulnerabilities. And of course, that's a very scary scenario. If you could, let's say, lead an early warning system to depict an incoming missile attack, and it could prompt a retaliatory blow. And if the whole thing was just a cyber creation, we could have some dire consequences. There's also, beyond just cyber interference with the nuclear forces and nuclear weapon systems and delivery systems, there's also the not mundane danger of interference with civilian nuclear power plants. And some of the conceivable actions there are very, very scary. Draining a spent fuel holding pond of the coolant that keeps combustion, prevents combustion, could lead to radioactive plumes that would be Chernobyl many times over. So there are some real dangers of cyber attacks against nuclear facilities. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I can only hope that some of the attention being focused on these threats, potential threats, vulnerabilities, are prompting remedial action by those concerned.
Yeah, okay, here you are linking two things that are part of the forum. We have a section on radiation risks, the possibility of a Chernobyl or Fukushima or something like that, and or much worse, and the possibility of using the prospect of using cyber weapons, and the overlap between those two is enough to give you pause. One of the things that we hope to do in this forum is come up with very specific recommendations of public policy proposals that, if implemented, would actually reduce some of these risks. So if you were each to write one proposal, and ours have to be about 15 words or less because they have to fit on one sheet of paper, one line of a sheet of paper. We're going to have 25 of them at the end that will be a policy that will, if you did all these 25 things well, you would reduce the risk of 6 different global threats, including the Fukushima thing, and including cyber attacks, and including nuclear war, and global warming, and famine, and pandemics, and something else. So Yeah, if you were to write a proposal for how to reduce the risk of cyber attacks, what would it look like? Let's put some additional policy proposals onto our platform, and people are going to choose from them when they get together on the 30th and say which are the most promising ways of actually reducing the risk. So now you're in charge of writing a new public policy that would reduce the risk of cyber threats. What are you going to say?
Well, Metta, I've responded to earlier requests from you for exactly those things. And 6 months ago, I suggested two, and they would still be my top two. One is an explicit support for maintaining cyberspace for peaceful purposes, the sort of cyber peace pleas. And the second, more specific, is what we were just discussing among the 2015 GGE recommendations, the key restraint measure of not targeting critical infrastructure. So I think those two would still be my suggestions.
You know, I'll come back to you in a minute because I want you to start thinking about how you're going to verify this. If you're really going to have a regime for controlling things, you've got to have something that you can check. Anyway, I want to give Allison a turn because you've never written one of my policy proposals for the platform, and it's your time now.
Well, geez, I don't know, at the risk of maybe sounding a bit like a copycat, I think I would also want to go down this road of doing more to elaborate cyber peace, to defend an idea of cyber peace. There's definitely this presupposition that, you know, cyberspace and the internet is already militarized and it's just going to be that way, and that's just how it's going to be used. And I think that's because that narrative is what's been dominant so far, and there hasn't sort of been enough careful thinking and work on the opposite side of that. That's something I know that Paul's been doing a lot of thinking and writing about, something that my organization hopes to do so this year. But I think we need to sort of rebalance the narrative a little bit because it's been very one-sided to date.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you're the leading figure in making that happen.
No.
Okay. Jack, now's your time. What are you going to say in addition to what you wrote, or a shorter version of what you wrote about 2 years ago?
Well, I'll give you a different take on it. I'll give you a legal take on it. I think one thing they should look to is making the writers, the manufacturers of software, liable for the flaws in their software. And this is, of course, something which Silicon Valley has hated, but they have for many years have had a policy of ship first, fix later. And a lot of the flaws you find in software, I think, directly comes from that. The industry is matured enough that they should be required to do that. A related one is with respect to some of the breaches that occur. There should be compulsory reporting of breaches that have occurred. There's already steps taken towards that, because that, first of all, alerts people. For example, if you were a Yahoo email holder, your email account was hacked a few years ago, and it took many years for Yahoo to actually fess up to the fact that 3 billion email accounts had been hacked. So these are two kind of legal solutions. They really point towards a solution, but they create incentives towards forming the industry, which of course is by and large develops the software and maintains the infrastructure, is starting to get their act together.
I like that. That's the kind of proposal that I think I'd vote for because I like the idea of making a law. Of course, then the problem is how are you going to catch the infractions? And so I've warned Paul that he's going to have to answer that question. How are you going to verify that rules are being followed when it comes to cyber stuff?
Well, it's not so straightforward, but I mean, I'm speaking as much about norms and normative behavior, and I think that is can be very influential. But also the attribution capabilities have been increasing over time, and you'll notice governments now with greater confidence, and indeed private sector security experts have been more forthcoming in identifying a culprit, particularly for state conducted or state sponsored attacks. So I think while it's not going to be the standards of the INF Treaty, though that's in trouble now itself, I think it is feasible to make arrangements that would be respected and where parties to it would have a degree of confidence that others were complying as well.
Okay, well, that's really interesting because it brings me to a final question, which isn't much of a question, and that is, I don't know how much confidence to attribute to people who say they know who the bad guy was who did a particularly egregious offense. Let's say the WannaCry offense or something, and especially the claims about Russian interference in the U.S. elections, because everybody I know who knows anything about cybersecurity says that the Russians have been way ahead of everybody else for ages in interfering with all kinds of things. They've been really leading the way in terms of international cyber crime, so to speak. And yet, I have a lot of friends in Russia. Well, I used to. Maybe I'm losing them because of having this disagreement. But they, every one of them, and these are mostly people who really don't like Putin and who do want democracy, and they're pro-Western and things like that. But even those guys say, no way could Russia have been involved in this. It could not possibly have had any influence on the U.S. election or anything else of any importance. And I don't know whether there's any real question or whether they simply are in denial. I mean, is it possible to really know who did what? Is verification something that you can be pretty confident about when you try to trace who did what? Or are there still a whole lot of questions there, even at best?
Well, the story coming out about the Russian troll farms and the enterprises which were dealing with it, the story came out, in fact, that the Russians, despite their expertise at hacking other people's systems, were in fact very poor at maintaining their own security. And the story came out that in fact their networks had been penetrated, and that the government agencies in the U.S. knew exactly what they were doing and who was doing it.
Is that an agreement among all of you that it's pretty easy to be sure who does what?
In that case, you can be. The WannaCry one was much harder, and some of the much more sophisticated operations. The U.S. election one essentially was just spreading all sorts of disruptive propaganda. But the much more targeted operations like WannaCry or some of the other ones are very, very hard to trace, because the people who are operating them typically run through a network of compromised networks. So it's like a collection of nesting dolls trying to get to the bottom of it. Very, very difficult.
Well, wonderful. I shouldn't say wonderful after you've just been saying how difficult something is, but wonderful that you've all been here having this conversation, and wonderful that people are watching and will be considering coming to the forum, which will take place at the University of Toronto, University College, on the 30th and 31st of this month. That's just a couple of weeks away. So you need to if you want a seat, you better go to Eventbrite and make a reservation or pay for it. And it's $120 for regular general admission kind of thing for the 2-day conference. Or if you're a student or unwaged, it's $50. So please go there and do that. The main reason I want you to do it now is because I have to figure out how many more seats I have available to let people buy. I don't know that. And the people are slow. I called yesterday a whole bunch of my friends and they said, oh yes, I'm coming. But they haven't signed up. And I don't know how many cups of coffee to order or how many cookies. So if you want a cookie, you better sign up in a hurry. And it's going to be really interesting because you can see the conversation we've had tonight about cyber. Well, you multiply that because we've got a whole bunch of other issues that we're going to deal with and see how they're interrelated. They really are interdependent in terms of one thing causing another. And therefore, very likely some of the policies that we develop have to be interdependent. And I'm going to ask all of you, if you will, because you did come forth with proposals for the platform, and please write them down. If you don't, I'll have to do it myself, but it'd be better if you do it. And send them to me because I want to put them on the platform. We have, I don't know, about 100 already, and there will be others. And one of the main purpose of the conference is to look seriously at these proposals and say, which ones actually might make a difference? Let's pick this number, 25 in all, that really will make the world safer if we implement them. And I think that's a different kind of challenge than we've been talking about in the past. I think it'll be a lot of fun. And we've got some wonderful people coming, like this guy Werbos I was telling you about, and Doug Roach. And we got a dinner speaker, this wonderful, my favorite journalist in Canada, Doug Saunders, will come and be telling us about democratization. So it's been fun being with you guys, and thank you for doing this. Come back next week, every Monday night, this time, 8 to 9. I'm going to be interviewing some of my friends, and I always enjoy it so much. Thank you, and so good night, folks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye now.